And she specializes in doing race equity.
Don't say I know where you're going. Don't say
Thank you all for getting up bright and early to attend the Journey Talks, which I understand were exciting, and will begin to show you how your colleagues are making the shift from awake to woke to work in their nonprofit and philanthropic organizations. That was an important part of the story we wanted to tell through the summit, is to allow leaders to come and share the work that they're doing inside of their organizations to build a race equity culture. But through the summit, we also wanted to explore some of the themes we touched upon in the publication, but didn't go into at great depth, such as intersectional race equity. So this morning, we're really fortunate to have members of Change Philanthropy, which is a coalition of philanthropy-serving organizations focused on identity-based groups in the philanthropy sector. And this panel was curated by the co-chair of Equity in the Center's Resource Mapping Working Group, the Coalition Catalyst for Change, Carly Hare. And so first up, we have Storm Gray from Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy. She'll be followed by Raquel Gutierrez from Hispanics and Philanthropy. Then by Lyle Matthew Kahn from Funders for LGBTQ Issues. And last but not least, by Aaron Dorfman from the National Center for Responsive Philanthropy. After they give their talks, they'll have a brief dialogue among themselves and then take questions from the audience. And then for those interested in talking with them further, you can attend their breakout session during the next portion of the agenda. So without further ado, Storm Gray.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. How are you all this morning? Good, good. So building a race equity culture. As Kay said, my name is Storm Gray. I'm the Director of Programs at Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, EPIP for short. We're a national organization of change makers, early to mid-career professionals who work in philanthropy and want to use philanthropy as a vehicle to advance social justice. I'm pretty sure that sounds familiar to a lot of you, because I would gather that most of you in the room feel the same way. Our mission is to empower emerging leaders and elevate philanthropic practice to promote a just, equitable, and more sustainable world. So when it comes to building an intersectional race equity culture, it starts with our community. You may see some familiar faces on the screen. Community is at the heart of EPIP's work. It's how we started in New York almost 20 years ago. It's what propels us forward even today, with about 16 chapters across the country. And when it comes to doing intersectional race equity work, we really have to start with the individual. Our theory of change is that working with individuals, activating those individuals, will then activate and transform the organizations and institutions that they work in, which thereby changes the sector. So we start very small and we work our way up. And in starting small, we listen to and we partner with our members on pretty much every major decision that we make as an organization, because one of the things that we value is shared leadership. We recognize that we are stronger when we work together, and we try to put that into practice every day in every way that we possibly can. So one of the things that I would say we've learned along this journey to building an intersectional race equity culture is the learning never stops, ever. Especially when you think about the fact that we're all on our own journey as professionals, as individuals who live our individual lives. We're all going from awake to woke to work, or as I say, we're all in a varied stages of awakening. So for us as an organization, that's really meant that we've had to challenge some of our own thoughts and beliefs and opinions and assumptions, and we've had to change and redo some of the ways that we operate. One of the things that we've heard from some of our members is that when it comes to chapters and chapter work, we're read as a predominantly white institution. And so one of our ways of addressing that is working with our chapters and our chapter leaders to make them more anti-oppressive spaces, make them more welcoming, and signaling to our members who are relatively diverse when you look at EPIP's membership, that this is a space for all folks who care about and are interested in working towards justice and liberation of peoples. And so with our chapters and with their feedback, we've gone through a couple of different trainings. We work with our board very closely to have conversations about shifting board culture. We've launched a People of Color, or relaunched actually, a People of Color Network program, which is meant to be a learning community that's exclusive for EPIP members of color, that really explores some of the challenges that are unique to being a person of color within philanthropy, because those of you who know or are people of color in philanthropy, it can be very challenging at times to show up, be heard, be your authentic self, grapple with what does that mean in a professional, predominantly white setting where white dominant culture tends to permeate every aspect of your work, and still be a whole person because you're also dealing with, things that happen outside of work. We had a Measuring a Leader project a couple of years ago, and most recently we launched a report that explored the experiences of early to mid-career professionals in philanthropy. It's called the Dissonance and Disconnects Report. And it highlights something that we knew, or a hypothesis that we had for a while, which is that within our membership, there is a perceived disconnect between the values that philanthropic institutions profess and the way that actually shows up. It's on our website. I encourage folks to read it. I won't get into a lot of the details because our time is limited and I really want to get to my change partners. But learning never stops for us because our goal is to create a cadre of smart, dedicated, inclusive leaders in philanthropy that possess an intersectional race equity analysis to their work at every single position, every single role within an institution. It is not just on the programmatic side, it's on the ops side of the house, it's on the finance side of the house, it's in your HR. Equity and diversity, equity, inclusion should not, and we believe does not, reside in the responsibility of only one person. It's the entire organization's responsibility. So we take that on by trying to provide leadership development opportunities for our members who are at all different levels within an institution, all different tenures within an organization, and seek to move them into positions where they can take this learning and apply it, and hopefully shift some of the ways that our organizations within the philanthropic sector are operating. So how do we do all this internally? I will say with a great deal of humility and partnership. Partnership remains at the heart of what EPIP does. Our change partners are our thought partners, co-conspirators, co-agitators at some times when it comes to moving these things forward. We are an organization that believes in a constantly learning environment, which means we take time to question even ourselves. There have been times when I know as a staff, like as a Black queer woman, I've had some conversations with staff and board members about, well, what does this decision mean? And are we really thinking about the people that we don't know, the identities that we don't carry, what does that mean for us in terms of doing the work? And so we try to recognize that we all have a shared humanity, and acknowledging the fact that there are those of us, all of us really, who carry things into our work. The workday doesn't stop at 9 to 5, and we really want to make sure that we are holding space for folks to process things. I know it's been very tough for some of the past couple of weeks. I would venture to say it's been tough for some of us since birth. And how that, I can't be anything if I'm not honest with you all. And so how we live in the world impacts how we think about our work. It impacts how we show up in our work. It impacts how we do our work. It impacts how we talk about our work. And I think that we really try to make space for folks to go through that and really bring their whole selves to work. And then intentionality, which was the last thing I wanted to say, which is basically that it's a process. We come back to it, we go back to it often, but it is something that we're dedicated to. And so when we do anything, like I'm thinking about our national conference that we had in Detroit, we worked very closely with a lot of partners to make sure that that particular experience was as inclusive as possible for the folks there. Working with disability rights advocates, working with activists that were on the ground in Detroit to try and make sure that folks had an experience that was rooted in justice, rooted in equity, and was also inclusive, and worked with local minority-based organizations as our partners. So getting intersectional race equity is challenging, and we know that we won't get there overnight. So we are learning from the past, looking at our own practices. We've actually revised our mission and vision, included in our strategic plan also, which you can find online, to ground us in equity, to drive forward our programming, which continues to evolve. And we are working every day in every way to make sure that we're doing some of the work that we have decided in partnership with our members that is important. So that means more focus on people of color within the sector. That means working with institutions to help them evaluate the biases that they may or may not know that they actually hold within their work. That means we'll be doing more advocacy in partnership and on the behalf of our members to change the institutions in which they work. We want to provide folks with the opportunity to really explore what race and equity and gender and diversity and equity inclusion, all of these terms that I think that we talk about within the work and within our sector that people say but may not actually have a deep understanding of what that means. It's so easy to say, I'm intersectional. What does intersectionality mean? Do you know the origins from whence it came? And I say that, not to be tongue in cheek, but just to acknowledge the fact that we're talking about some very real world issues that have real world consequences. So we want to make sure that through our programming and through our members, they understand what that means. So one of the things that we've done is we have shifted some of our internal practices. I'll just give a quick example and then I'll wrap up my talk. So hiring is one way in which an organization can impact diversity within their institution, but it's also one way that they can practice being inclusive. So when we hired one of our recent new positions, we actually did a blind hiring process where we did not ask for a resume. We asked like a 2-question intro question, and then it immediately went to a phone interview, because one of the things that we did not want is to be influenced by one's pedigree, which often shows up on a resume. We want to know, can you do the work? Do you understand the mission? Are you committed to the mission? And if so, then we can talk about, where have you worked previously? But we wanted to actually hear from the individual. And I will say that it garnered one of the most diverse pools that we've had in our hiring process to date. Our new director is amazing. It's not me, it's someone else. But I am also amazing. You gotta clap for yourself, But I just say that to say, I think sometimes when we talk about being inclusive and advancing racial equity and advancing justice, it sounds so high-minded and difficult. But one of the things that I would say I've learned from Adrienne Maree Brown's book, Emergent Strategies, is that change is in the small things. So as an organization, we really try to look at the small things. That's why we focus on the individual, because if you can't make an impact on the individual, you're not going to have the kind of impact that you want on this sector, because sectors are run by people. And if people don't get it, then the sector will never get it. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I really just wanted to say that on the podium, but no, seriously, thank you. Thank you all, that's been my talk. And I'll pass it on to Raquel next.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Buenos dias. Ooh, that's so nice to hear. I love it. So I'm Raquel Gutierrez with Hispanics and Philanthropy. I'm the new Director of Leadership and Learning. This is my 91st day on the job. And it's a great way to celebrate with this incredible, beautiful audience here. And thank you to the folks who invited us here. Hispanics and Philanthropy is on a mission to realize an equity agenda through leadership, equity, and influence. We want to do that by democratizing philanthropy to increase meaningful, what we call actually bigger and better resources to nonprofits on the ground who are doing the work and don't typically get funded. and also by building not just a leadership pipeline, but a leadership ecosystem, something really similar to what you were talking about, Storm. Just where can we invade everywhere, right? And really pay attention to all sides of the house in philanthropy and nonprofits. And then finally, we're working to cultivate voice and influence, doing that through many different ways, some of which I'll talk about in my short presentation. But we've been asked to talk about navigating the intersectional race equity journey. And let me tell you, this is not it. Like sitting down in a circle, happy, not it. It's actually, there are moments of liberating joy from those moments, those fleeting moments of insight that you get from conversations and engaging with other people. But it is fleeting. And so I actually think it looks more like this. It's opaque often. One moment it's heavy. One moment it can be light and fleeting, like a cloud that brings thunderstorms. You know, all those times we're crying in those conversations. But it waters something, right? Water is life. And so it brings us something. And so it's worth being in the conversation. The equity journey that we're all on, whether we like it or not, is cyclical. It requires patience to grow something of substance that is worth defending. So to take the time to do it and be in it is really critical. So we've been asking ourselves, what are the conditions necessary to be in this conversation, to hold spaces like this for other people? And what we realized is that before we could really even dive into that, we needed to sit back and do some reflection and do what good organizers always do, which is begin to understand context and history. So the most recent cycle of HIP's equity journey began in January of this year when a new CEO and president was hired and required all of us again to understand our own history. So we're an organization celebrating 35 years of being in existence, working across the Americas, in Central America, in Mexico, and the United States and Puerto Rico. A new CEO and president after 27 years of a founding leader who, when they started this organization, it was revolutionary. An organization that works across the Americas where concepts like democracy, vary, and terms like Latinx mean something here but not there. How do we manage to navigate that? As Latinos, regardless of our status, we are increasingly targeted for prison, cages, and exile. Since our transition into new leadership, HIP is increasingly clear that we have a moral obligation to justice, and that is why we work for equity. So what does it take? Well, number one thing, it takes being honest with ourselves. And when I'm talking about being honest with ourselves, I'm not just talking about us as an organization being honest, which I'll talk about in a minute, but really, like Storm said, it starts with the individuals. So if I could have played Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror as I stepped on stage, I would have, because I love that song, but it's really about what is necessary, which is taking an unflinching look at yourself in the mirror and being honest. And so this means recognizing things like, where does internalized colonization show up when how I'm interacting with people or deciding programs or engaging with the folks in the community? And also, when do I recognize my own white fragility as a person of color that I've been steeped into, trained into, come out, even though I come from an organizing family? So one way I do this is, I'll give you an example. Individually, when I'm doing programmatic work, I work with leaders who are mid-career Latinx professionals in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. So if any of you are interested, let me know after. And I'm working with this amazing consultant. His name is Michael Soto. He's from Arizona. He's the executive director of an organization called Equality Leads, and he is phenomenal. And he's been doing a lot of the research for the programmatic work of what we work with the folks who are in our leadership program. And sometimes he'll present something to me, and this is how I know the last one is always present, because I do something like, oh my, like, I don't know, like, that's kind of pushing it, right? And then when I have my oh my moment, it becomes an aha moment that makes me realize, oh my goodness, girl, like, that's some white fragility coming up in you. What is that about? And so then I step back, I take a breath. Honestly, sometimes I feel ashamed. Sometimes I feel embarrassed. But I do what my mama said. I take a breath and keep moving forward. And so this is how I know that I'm doing the work as an individual within HIP, because I'm challenging myself to recognize, to be patient, to slow down. Great. So organizationally, a commitment to cultivating race equity culture is in an intersectional context shows up in what might seem like a really simple gesture. And as you pointed out earlier, Storm, with Adrienne Marie Brown's work, it is about simple gestures. And one of those happened recently when we were looking at material for our conference. And we had a series of photos that we wanted to have represent the Latinx community for this conference. And a staff member said, I don't think that's a good image to represent us. Guess what the image was? Somebody. Who said that? Who said that? Yeah, It was about this distinction between light and dark Latinx folks. And how do we come to adjust that as an intersectional piece of our work? And another staff member said, tell me, why doesn't that stand out to you as a representative of a Latinx person? And they had a conversation, and it wasn't like a easygoing conversation. It was like a little bit of a tense conversation. And then afterwards, the woman who said, I don't think it's the right image, she sat back in her chair physically, and she said, yeah, I get it, wow, I'm wrong. And the other person just held that person's dignity in that moment. Didn't shame them, didn't push them. So when we do intersectional work, as we're coming into the being of that work and the enlightenment of that work, how do we hold each other with compassion and love, which is, of course, in part the meaning of philanthropy, right? Organizationally, from a programmatic perspective, it comes in these three ways: building and leveraging intersectional power at the local and national level, and I'll explain the photos in a moment. Expand and sharpen the narrative, inclusive of racial and other diversity, and strengthen Latino voice and visibility in philanthropy, and then finally, strengthening the ecosystem of Latinos in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. The first one is a photo from recently we had a learning visit to the border in San Diego. We chose San Diego very specifically because San Diego is really known to have multiple types of people coming through that area. So we were able to meet with Haitians, we were able to meet with folks from other places other than just Central America and Mexico. And we took 55 funders, and I think to date have raised about $1.4 million to be able to give back to organizations and communities who are doing this work on the ground. The second photo is a representation of expanding and sharpening the narrative. We're doing that through a new mini grant that we're offering, which is a matching grant around civic participation, focusing on states in the South who really need support to be able to do this work. And we're not talking about the get out the vote and register to vote. Those are super important, and large organizations are doing that work. We're talking about folks who are doing the everyday leadership development of people in the community to be able to engage in a wide variety of activities. And then the last one is strengthening the leadership ecosystem, which that's a photo of our current cohort of programs. And then also we'll be working on a leadership trustee circle to help build an equity agenda. Finally, I just want to say thank you for allowing us to be here to talk with you. I look forward to the conversation with my peers, and you all have a good day.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? It's on. Now? All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I immediately hit the wrong button, and I was told about 5 times how to do this. I also thought it was a good idea to go third, and now I'm not so sure. I probably should have gone first. But good morning to all of you. It's really great to be here with all of you and to be up here with our amazing change colleagues. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you about what does racial equity look like at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. And I'm really excited to be here in Baltimore, and not just because I get to see my dad's new puppy again, but because I get to talk about Funders for LGBTQ Issues' important work on this topic. So for those of you that aren't familiar with us, Funders for LGBTQ Issues is a national philanthropy-serving organization that is really dedicated to building the philanthropic resources and increasing those resources for LGBTQ communities. We do that in 3 key ways. The first thing we do is we do convenings and collective action. So we have conferences like this one. Our main one is called Funding Forward. It happens in March. It will be in Tucson next year, and we invite many of you to join us there. The second thing we do, and our convening and collective action also includes working groups and initiatives like Out in the South and Grant Makers United for Trans Communities. The second thing we do is we offer outreach and support services. So we specifically look to focus on foundations that have some sort of justice focus, but aren't yet funding LGBTQ issues. And then we help them, we offer them kind of the technical assistance necessary to make their first LGBTQ grant. And my colleague Rebecca Wasowski is here, and she leads that important work. So anyone interested in that work should definitely talk to her. And the last thing we do is research and communications, which is where I sit. We publish an annual tracking report, a biannual global resources report, and a lot of other specialty reports and infographics. And that work really looks at trends, gaps, and opportunities related to LGBTQ grant making. As many of you may know, LGBT grant making currently is less than $200 million a year, which basically means for every $100 that foundations award, only 29 cents goes to LGBTQ communities. So it's really a small slice of the pie, and we're trying to change that. But why are we here, right? Why is the gay group here? Why are we here to talk about racial equity, about racial justice? The first thing I always say is I always think, Funders for LGBTQ Issues is not a racial equity organization. We think of ourselves as a racial justice organization. And that is specifically baked into our DNA. Our mission reads, Funders for LGBTQ Issues works to increase the scale and impact of philanthropic resources aimed at enhancing the well-being of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities, promoting equity, and this is the key part, and advancing racial, economic, and gender justice, right? So it's a part of our mission. But how did we get there, right? That doesn't just happen overnight. So I want to take you briefly through a timeline of Funders for LGBTQ Issues. So we were founded in 1982. We were founded at the National Network of Grant Makers Conference that year, when we became the working group on funding for lesbian and gay issues. And for those of you who know or are curious, those are 2 of our founders, Catherine Acey and Michael Seltzer. So we were founded really at the height of the AIDS epidemic, right? And at the time that we were founded actually, foundation funding for LGBTQ issues totaled only $200,000 a year, right? And so there's $200,000 a year going to LGBTQ people. People are friends and lovers are dying on the street. And these foundations are doing nothing, government's doing nothing. So we were founded not only to increase the resources, but really as a support group for our community, right? To help people who are working in philanthropy deal with these structures that weren't supporting their friends and lovers that were literally dying. If we fast forward about a decade to 1992, that was when the organization began to formalize. That's when we became Funders for Lesbian and Gay Issues, and that's an important distinction, right? We were Funders for Lesbian and Gay Issues at that point. That was when we hired our first staff person, Nancy Cunningham, and that was when we began to do kind of the core things that we do today, right? We started hosting convenings. We started doing our own research because, mainstream research organizations out there weren't interested in tracking funding for lesbian and gay issues. And we started hosting and really organizing sessions at mainstream philanthropy conferences, right? Forcing the field to really confront LGBTQ issues. If we fast forward another 10 years or so to the mid-2000s, that's when we really began expanding our mandate and getting serious about racial justice. So, by 2005, we hired our second executive director, Karen Zellemeyer, and that was when we changed our name to Funders for LGBTQ Issues to really reflect the full diversity of our community, right? We weren't just gay and lesbian. We had a lot of other people that we were really interested in supporting and increasing philanthropic resources for. It can't just be about increasing the funding. It needs to be about increasing the funding to what end? It's not just about pouring more money into gay choirs. And gay choirs are great, right? But it's about what is that money actually doing? What kind of systems change are we interested in here, right? And that was when we changed our mission, and we included an explicit call out to racial, economic, and gender justice, and when we launched the Racial Equity Initiative. And some of you might remember that, and I think that had a lot of successes, and it also had some challenges. We had some challenges with that work, right? And I'll talk about that more in a second. Fast forward another 10 years to the 2012 to the present. So even with those challenges, right, that racial equity work really allowed us to get to the point where in 2012 we hired our first CEO of color in then Francisco Malba. And we were able to build a staff where now racial justice is baked into everything we do. And for reference, that is a cute little picture, fairly recent picture of our staff. So what was the Racial Equity Initiative, right? So as I mentioned, funding for LGBTQ people is extremely low. LGBTQ people face a number of alarming disparities in health and education and almost anything that you can name. And it's far worse for LGBTQ people of color, right? We just know that. The disparities are worse and the funding is worse. So in the early to mid-2000s, we came up with the Racial Equity Initiative, and it was really a way to get more funding to LGBTQ communities of color. It consisted of new programming, new research efforts, some small re-granting. And I think what's most critical about this, though, is at that point, right, we were talking to our members. And at this point, LGBTQ funding was really small, and LGBTQ funding is still, to this day, about 40% of it, at that point it was a larger portion, comes from foundations that were explicitly founded by and for LGBTQ people. So private foundations that were founded by wealthy gay and lesbian donors, and then public foundations that were founded by LGBTQ communities where they weren't getting any money and they needed to raise the money and re-grant it to their communities. So we came in and we thought, we know everything, we should just start pushing this racial justice stuff on them. And that really didn't actually go over that well, as you can imagine. They were already feeling intense pressure just to support LGBTQ communities. And when we came out with reports like the report card that's in the middle there, they didn't like really being judged, right? And they felt like it was kind of unfair. They were already dealing with a marginalized community, and here we were telling them that they needed to do better. And we came out a little heavy-handed. The word that we got a lot was finger wagging, which is not something you want your members to tell you. And really that led to a trying time for the organization, right? We thought that we were doing the right thing, but we lost a lot of members. We started having declining revenue. People were turning away from us. And so that led to a shift in the organization to where we are today and what racial justice work looks like today. As I said, that was, I think, really important because it laid the groundwork for us to be able to hire our first CEO of color. It laid the groundwork for DNA for racial justice to be really embedded in our DNA. And I think that was really important. And we realized that we needed to shift focus. We needed to shift focus as the group that is primarily focused on LGBTQ issues. We needed to figure out how we put racial justice into everything we do, but didn't explicitly kind of push it and didn't take that kind of far left flank approach, if that makes sense. So what does that look like today at Funders for LGBTQ issues? Because as I said, it's really baked into everything we do. I mean, our staff is majority people of color, our board is half people of color. When I think through all of our work, right, we work closely with all of our change groups. We did that infographic with APIP. We're currently working on one with APFI and with HIP. So it looks like focusing on certain specific segments of the LGBTQ communities of color and highlighting those needs, those assets, and that underfunding, and pushing our funders to do more, but encouraging them to do so, right? We offer a lot more carrots than sticks nowadays. It also looks like having, at our Funding Forward conference, having 75% of our speakers be speakers of color, and 25% of our speakers be trans and gender nonconforming. So even though we will have explicit programming like centering Black lives and LGBTQ philanthropy, even when we don't have explicit programming, right, that's explicitly focused on a racial justice topic, we'll be bringing in perspectives of LGBTQ people of color and making sure that that's still present in the conversation, which I think is really important. So I was told we're getting towards the end and I really need to wrap up. And I'm a quick talker, so I really need to wrap this up. But I want to talk kind of like, what does an ecology look like? And I want to reference my own family here to kind of say, I think there are different roles for all of us to play. So this is in late 80s, early 90s, Olson Mills family photo, if you guys remember Olson Mills. And I think the fashion also kind of gives it away. So this is my family. My dad is Chinese, my mom is Irish. So I come from a mixed race background, which I really think informs a lot of how I've viewed the world and how I've come to this work. And also fits into how Funders fits into this work. Obviously that's my dad, that's my mom. I'm wearing this like weird pink fuchsia shirt. Again, it was like the 80s, 90s, early 90s, fashion. And that's my younger sister and my younger brother. And I was thinking about my family because I was thinking about the role that Funders plays, right? And where do we fit in this ecology? Because I think we all have a place in this ecology. We all have a role to play. And I remember, without, being too harsh on myself, like I was a bit of the troublemaker in the family, right? Like, hard to believe now, I know. But I was the agitator, I was the one that always pushed the limits. My brother and sister didn't have curfews because I never obeyed our curfews. And so, I feel like they all benefited from my agitating. And I think there are certainly groups in this room that we need a left flank that agitates people, right? Like we need those groups. And they play a very important role in our ecosystem. And then we had people like my sister, who was very much wanting to please my parents, was very, a little bit more accommodationist. And I think that's a role to play too. And then we had my brother, who was an agitator and shared, I think, a lot of my values, but wasn't as far out there as me, right? Like wasn't like blatantly like arguing with my parents, was much more kind of under the line. And that's kind of the role that I see Funders playing, right? I think that we share all the racial justice values that, the Change Philanthropy group shares. We believe in them strongly and we incorporate it. We've embedded it into our DNA. We put it into all of our programming. We put it into all of our research. But we're not going to be that far left flank agitator, right? We've decided that like we know where our lane is. That doesn't mean that we won't highlight far left agitators at our own conference and really draw attention to the important work that they're doing. But it means that we recognize that there is an ecosystem here that we need to support, and we all need to play our own roles, right? And the last thing I just want to mention is, because I see this and I feel this very strongly as a gay biracial man and as our work at Funders, a lot of our work falls under the Trojan horse strategy, I say, right? And I say that because people come to talk to us, they think they're talking about gay things. And then all of a sudden, like, we're able to insert a conversation about racial justice. When we do our training on LGBTQ cultural competency, right, we're able to talk to people about how are you thinking about the ways that communities of color are affected by this. We've partnered with APFI to make sure our trainings are stronger to that extent. We've learned from the Philanthropic Initiative on Racial Equity how we can be stronger in that area. And it is a learning process for us, but we are able to kind of step into that space and step into spaces that, that far left flank and that other racial justice activists won't be able to, and we're able to carry that mantle forward. And with that, I think I will end there and welcome questions for the conversation and introduce Aaron.
Great to be with you. Lyle, I can't wait to get into that conversation about the ecosystem and the far left flank and all of that when we sit down on the couch here in a minute. Raquel, I did the math. I'm on my 4,295th day as the president and CEO of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. So if you can't tell just by looking at me, I identify as a straight, white, cisgender man who doesn't live with any disabilities. So what the heck am I doing up here in this conversation about intersectional racial equity? Well, the fact is, should advance the slides off of his family. The fact is that the lack of racial equity in our society is harming all of us. And straight white people should be every bit as committed to promoting equity as those who are more directly harmed by our unjust society. One of my favorite quotes comes from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. It hangs on a wall above my desk. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and we are caught in an inescapable web, this inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And I wish more of my fellow white people in our sector could truly understand that. If they did, they would act to change things. So I've been leading NCRP for the past 12 years. For those of you not familiar with us, NCRP is the only independent watchdog for philanthropy. We work to ensure that philanthropy is responsive to those who have been marginalized or left out of our society in some way. And encouraging funders to do more to promote intersectional racial equity is a huge part of our mission. So our work to influence foundations and high net worth donors takes a number of different forms. Sometimes we write provocative op-eds, like this one that I wrote after the white supremacist attacks in Charlottesville a little over a year ago. This op-ed was shared 500 times in the first couple of days on Facebook and has had thousands and thousands of page views, one of our more popular pieces of the last few years. Another example is one that I co-authored with Ana Marie from Hispanics and Philanthropy and Nelson Colon from Puerto Rico Community Foundation about the racial disparate response of philanthropy to the hurricanes that happened last year and how philanthropy was underinvesting in Puerto Rico. Op-eds are one way we do it. We do a lot of sessions at conferences. Me and the team are at about 40 or 50 conferences a year doing presentations, whether it's a keynote like I did at the Yale Philanthropy Conference this year, or the Southern California Grantmakers Family Philanthropy Conference, or the hundreds of other conferences that go on in the sector where we do breakout sessions. We have a really talented team who can be in a lot of places and push the racial equity conversation at every opportunity that we get. We also produce content that helps drive the conversation. And over the last few years, for example, we've published a series of reports about the importance of investing in social change in the South. And you can't do good philanthropy in the South if you're not dealing forthrightly with race. This past spring, we published a self-assessment toolkit. Power Moves helps funders assess how well they're doing at building power, sharing power, and wielding power for equity and justice. And racial equity is integral throughout the Power Moves toolkit. So I could go on about those kinds of content products, but you get the idea. And if you sign up for our emails, you'll learn about all of them. One of the biggest challenges, though, with this work is the lack of direct power in relation to the people whose practices we're trying to influence. When I was a community organizer before I came to NCRP, we had direct power in relationship to the elected officials we were trying to influence. If they weren't responsive to us, we could vote them out of office. But foundations and high net worth donors don't have to be accountable to anyone if they don't want to. So long as they don't violate the law, they can do whatever they want. They can be mediocre in perpetuity if they want to. So the web of programs that we've tried to create over the years is designed to exert the most influence possible given this lack of a direct power relationship. So let me pivot, though, for a moment and talk about our internal work. As a white-led organization that's serious about racial equity, we pay special attention to a few things that I think are worth sharing. First of all, we have an incredibly diverse staff. This photo is from our summer staff retreat this summer. We're diverse in terms of race, gender, age, sexual orientation, countries of origin, and more. And some of us come from privilege, some grew up poor, and the diversity is really intentional, and it makes us stronger. I can't tell you how many times we've come up with better ideas, better solutions to challenging problems because different people on the team see those problems from different points of view. Second, we make sure to maintain a diverse board, too. Currently, more than half of our board members identify as people of color, and more than half are women. A quarter of our board identifies as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and one of our board members identifies as a person with a disability. But just maintaining a diverse board didn't seem to be enough to us. CEOs have a lot of power in nonprofits, NCRP included, and we wanted to be intentional about balancing my power. And we knew that if we weren't careful, We could have significant representation of people of color on the board, but still have an overwhelmingly white way of looking at the work. So another step we've taken in recent years is made sure that our executive committee is 100% people of color, as an intentional way to sort of balance my white perspective and power in the organization. So the executive committee does my performance review. The executive committee works with me to set the agenda for upcoming board meetings. I run significant dilemmas and decisions that I need to make by the executive committee. And so this structural change we made ensures that my white perspective is being informed and enhanced by the amazing leaders of color on our board. I don't have to tell anyone in this room that, now is the time for us to put equity at the center of our work of the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. We can make real progress, and it takes serious action from all of us. It's so great to be in the room with people who are committed to this. Thank you.
One of the things that I think that Raquel said that I wanted to come back to is this idea of water as healing and restorative, and what it means for us to kind of roll with the ebbs and flows. And I think we've all kind of shared how within our own respective institutions, we've had some high points and some low points and some points for learning.
I'm going to move over here because
you don't want to sit next to me here.
The PowerPoint is like right in my eyes.
So I'm curious to know, what were the moments where you really had to have your own personal conversation with self in doing some of this work to kind of check yourself and figure out if you're doing the right thing? What was that like for you guys?
So for me, I've been an ED for my entire career. I was made an ED at far too young an age. And I was really a terrible supervisor, especially of people of color, when I first started out. And I remember a time when I was supervising a young African-American man organizer, and he ended up quitting and leaving the organization because I was a lousy supervisor. And the thing that I was doing so wrong was I thought the only way to do something was the way I would do it. And I was trying to force him to do his community organizing work the way I did my community organizing work. And that wasn't a style that worked for him.
Right.
And I gave him no space to be who he was and approach the work the way he thought it would be effective. And losing a talented staff member, that made me that was a big wake-up call to me early in my career to help me think about how can I be different, how can I show up differently.
And I can build up that. I can do you one better, actually, which is a traumatic moment that we had at Funders. I'm the director of research and communications, so I oversee all of our communications. And I think we had a really good learning when Funders for LGBTQ Issues decided, I think this was definitely before Charlottesville. I think this was when the horrible church shooting happened. And we were trying to be at the forefront of making statements. This was before Trump, so we were not as policy driven as we are now because we felt like we had the luxury not to be. And we decided that we were going to make a statement. And I think this is where I think, to both your points, right? It is continual learning.
Yeah.
There's a continual process, right? I think we're fairly good. I'm mixed race. Our staff is majority people of color, but we're still not immune from error, right? And I think that we all need to give ourselves that space. And even just beyond racial justice, right? I know we're still trying to be better about disability at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. But I remember the specific incident clearly because, as is often the case, I'm sure, for all of our groups, we're doing 5 million more things than we have the people to do. And we decided we needed to make a statement, and it just so happened that at the time my research and communication person was an African American, was an African woman, a black woman from Africa, and we decided, she's in communications, and this is a great thing, we should have her write it. And so one, we made a mistake because we tokenized her. Secondly, she wrote a very personal piece, and that's not our style at Funders, right? We were trying to make a statement, and so we had to edit that piece. And our editing was misinterpreted as being horribly demeaning to her personal view, as not sharing the same convictions as the Black Lives Matter movement, and that created some real conflict internally, and we had to have conversations about that and work through that. And I like to think, that was one of my most difficult moments as a manager, because I was actually the one that edited the piece at first and, wrote red lines on stuff, and definitely shouldn't have done that and should have had a different approach. But we learned from that, right? Like, we would never today put someone in that position to write something like that, right? Like, as we've had subsequent things, like we don't, for example, like when we do have these statements now, like we don't turn to Marvin, our Black director of finance administration, and be like, you should be the spokesperson on this, right? We step up into allyship, which I really do think is where funders sits in this racial equity work. It's like being a good ally, right? An example, a partner that's not here is Native Americans in philanthropy. I remember when the whole, oh my God, I'm horrible with sports. What's the sports team that's super racist name?
Redskins?
This is like my Game Boy thing. The
Washington Redskins?
Yeah. I knew it was bad, I just didn't know what it was.
Okay. Sports.
Sports, right?
The
Yeah.
sports.
The sports, that game, But I remember that when that came out, I remember funders and a couple of the other groups leading the charge saying, Change needs to issue a statement on this, and it shouldn't be Native Americans in philanthropy that are left to do this on their own.
Yeah.
And I think that there is power in that. There's room for all of us to be allies in different spaces. And as I reflect back, on my family photos, I said my brother was not as much of an agitator as I was, and that meant my parents heard him more than they heard me. Yes. Because whenever I did something, they just saw me as like, oh, there's Matt being bad again. Like, versus when my brother said something, it had a little bit more power. And I think that was really one of the big learnings that I had from that moment was, one, we shouldn't tokenize. We should have better systems around all of this. And also that there is important moments for us to be allies and for us to take on the work, especially when it's challenging for folks.
I just wanted to add on to that. So my situation is a little different, and it wasn't where I'm currently employed at Hispanics and Philanthropy, but I think a transformational moment was an awakening where I realized how disrespected and devalued I was, and that in that moment I actually became safer because I realized how much harm I was potentially in. So I could reach out to people, I could create spaces for me to have support. And I think oftentimes, at least when I was doing this work prior, I wanted to really believe that the people I was working with were with me. And they were to what they could be.
Yeah.
And it wasn't sufficient. And so one of the things I just want to say about even how we learn is to be thoughtful and cognizant of who do we learn on the backs of. And it's great that we can learn, but if we're doing that at the expense of others without some real, come to Jesus with that person, not like with the concept, but with the person, I think we're in a bad place if we can't go back and make the repair with the individual. So just wanted to add that. I have another question for everyone because I know we're supposed to. And that is, I know several of us mentioned the ecosystem. So I'm just curious about anybody's further thoughts on looking at the ecosystem of philanthropy or the nonprofit sector, and what's really pulsating right now for you that feels urgent about tending to the ecosystem?
I think one of the things that remains urgent to me, and it actually goes to something that you mentioned, Erin, is this idea of promotion, particularly of, so I'm extrapolating, of white people into higher level positions, possibly before their tenure, and what that means for managing diverse talent. And I think that is urgent, and I say that as someone with their own personal experiences. Part of what brought me to EPIP, as a member, so I used to actually be an EPIP member before becoming staff. I was a board member, a chapter leader. Shout out to EPIP DC, Caitlin, I see you in the audience. Was being mismanaged in an institution that did not quite understand nor appreciate what I'm going to call my own brilliance. And I say that because I think sometimes as women of color, particularly as Black women, we have a very challenging time owning the things that we know and the experiences that we carry. So I say that to just push myself to speak my own truth. So I think when I look at our membership, these are folks who come to the sector that are eager to change the world and they want to do good work, and they're in these institutions and in positions that maybe dim their light a little bit. And you know, our membership, while it is diverse, our sector in philanthropy is predominantly white. So I recognize that even within our membership, you know, there may be opportunities for some of our members to be promoted in an accelerated fashion in comparison to some of our other members. So I want to make sure that whoever is within EPHIP's membership, you know, understands the personal responsibility that they have to do this work and show up as allies for people in spaces who have identities that may not be their own. So even like, you know, Lyle, we also struggle with disability rights, and like we recognize that there are some spaces where ableism shows up in a very nasty way in our work. And so now we're trying to figure out, well, how do we change that? What does that look like? You know, what are the spaces that we can lean on some of our change partners to change some of the work that we're doing, change some of the professional development programs that we're offering, so that we're really being the kind of allies that we are hoping for our members to be. So when I think about the things that really energize me, particularly about the work that EPHIP does, it's focusing on the individual, because I think that what I said before, if we're not looking at the people and the people in the work, then the work is just going to continue to be messy and junky and, you know, pardon my candor, but like trash. Like it's not going to be the kind of work that we want to see. It's not going to have the kind of change that we want to have.
So the ecosystem is super important. Like all the different players working in different ways, like that really matters. You can see it all the time when you see one foundation's journey and you sort of track who influenced them and how. I know that it's really important to have all those different perspectives. We try to be that left flank that you were talking about and create more space for other people to talk about things. We happily take on that role and try to push as hard as we can while still being credible and respected. But that creates much more room for other groups to work and organize. So, and then you can create new normal. I remember 10 years ago when we were launching our effort to try to get foundations to fund more organizing and advocacy and civic engagement work. A lot of our advisors were saying, don't use those words. Don't talk about advocacy. Use a nicer word for it. And we said, no, we're never going to get anywhere. We're going to use that word. We're going to use it over and over and over again. We're going to hammer it home over a period of years. We're going to talk about the tangible benefits for families and communities when foundations do, in fact, fund advocacy and organizing and civic engagement work. And you know what? Now people use those words. So sometimes you just got to make that decision to push the envelope and do it consistently over time, and then things shift if you're lucky.
I do think the ecosystem also shifts, right? Like the environments that we operate in shift. I think Trump is a great bad example of that. I think a more positive example is, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And I promise I don't have any jewelry on that's doing that. I think a better example of shifting in a really positive way is when we launched our Out in the South initiative. Right? We operated, and I'll just give you guys some really horrible examples of how that launched too. And we have Southern leaders that lead that now, but I remember my colleague Christina and I, when we first, and I shared this with the partners on the stage, when we first launched this, we were like, it's called Out in the South. We're like, we have a great name. We should call it Southern Pride, and we'll just have little rainbows coming up from the South. The Northerner perspective clearly was not playing well and not really understanding a lot of the context of what was happening in the South. And I'm really glad, that we hired the right people not to do that, right? Ben, our CEO, and Marvin clearly just looked at Christina and I in disgust and shock. But the point is, I remember when we started that initiative, right? I remember we did message testing in the South. We thought what would resonate. How can we talk to people? At that time, the South is still underfunded, but at that time, LGBT people in the South were receiving like next to nothing, and more LGBTQ people live in the U.S. South than in any other region in the country, right? So the fact that like per capita, that LGBT people down there were receiving like $4 in philanthropy support, whereas like the Pacific and the Northeast were receiving closer to $12 was an issue that we wanted to address. But we call ourselves funders for LGBTQ issues. We were told we certainly couldn't say queer, in the South, right? And when we went down there, I still remember having to explain the acronym, and people wouldn't say lesbian. So our Out in the South director, Chantel Fisherborn, she used to judge people would they confidently say lesbian out loud? Or be are you a lesbian? Or would they say lesbian, and Becca could probably correct me, but I remember there used to be exercises where people would have to say lesbian out loud. And that ecosystem has started to shift. We found amazing partners that have occupied a different space than us in Southeast Council on Foundations, right? We've seen that increase dramatically. The funding in the U.S. South in the last 3 or 4 years has increased fourfold for LGBTQ communities. There still is a lot of work to be done there. A lot of that's actually coming from national funders, and we want to see more of that coming from place-based funders in the U.S. South. But we've seen that ecosystem change slowly, and I think that speaks to what different strategies can do. We had our strategy. There was great grassroots LGBTQ groups in the U.S. South, like Song and Get Equal, that were pushing people in different directions, and we were able to play the nice guy role. And that's where I think you can see the environment shift. And my point is going to be that now that the environment has shifted, we do say LGBTQ, right? We talk very passionately about trans issues now, where we were much more focused on the L and the G in the beginning of our journey there. So,
How are we for time?
I think we might need to wrap up.
Are we?
Lead us, Kay.
Conversation is so
Right.
great. I hate to bring this up, but the dialogue will continue in a breakout session. But we do have 3 minutes, so perhaps you could take one question from the audience. Would that work? Who has a question? A burning question.
no pressure to be the one question.
Right.
My question is a little bit rhetorical, which is what, in the last 3 minutes, could you leave us with your action step as you sort of go through the day based on your experiences, and sort of what brought you to this stage? What would you want us to be taking away from today's conversation?
Mine's do your work. Do your own personal work. All of us have to do it. It doesn't matter who we are. And be compassionate with yourself and hold other people in the true meaning of philanthropy, which is love for humanity.
I would say be courageous. I don't think anybody ever on their deathbed says, oh, I wish I hadn't spoken up as much as I did about the issues that matter to me, right? It takes all of us being as courageous as we can be if we're going to keep moving this forward.
So I agree with everything that's said, and I would also just say that I think that, really always trying to be better, I think, is key. And realizing that you can be better and being gentle with yourself, right? We're going to make mistakes. And I think, everyone in this room shares a common goal, a common vision, right? Let's help each other make those improvements that are necessary, but let's not beat ourselves up, right? We have a lot of other people out there we might want to be beating up, but let's not beat up the people in this room. And let's try and lift everyone up and help everyone on this journey. And realize that people have different roles to play.
I would say the work cannot wait. So there are only but so many people in this room. Think about your colleagues who are not here. So my challenge to you all is, how are you taking what you learn and experience in this space and sharing it as broadly within your institutions as possible? Because you are only but one piece in the equation. So make sure that you're taking what you learn and building connections while you're here that continue beyond the 2 days that we've been together.
Well, thank you. I think you'll join me in thanking the fabulous panelists. And one quick note I did want to make on change, because there are philanthropy folks in the audience, but there are also a lot of nonprofit folks who may not be familiar with philanthropy serving organizations, and a couple of acronyms were used. So ABFE is the Association of Black Foundation Executives. APIP is Asian American Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. Another member group
Native
is
Americans.
Native Americans in Philanthropy, and the Women's Funders Network. Is that it?
WFN, NFG, Neighborhood Funders
Neighborhood Funders Group. And when I was at a firm that serviced the nonprofit and philanthropic sector, I had no idea about affinity groups. So for those of you who aren't in philanthropy, I would encourage you to check them out because there are resources that could be helpful to you. I know for myself personally, I probably would have lasted a lot longer if I had known these groups were a resource. So thank you to our panelists, and go forth to the breakout sessions, and we will see you back here for lunch.